9 years later, the hillside would be covered in chestnut trees so tall that sunlight struggled to reach the ground. But on the morning it all began, there was nothing there except dry earth, tangled weeds, and one man kneeling alone with a shovel. His name was Daniel. He pressed the first chestnut sapling into the soil with hands already rough from years of work. Behind him, two neighbors watched from the road. One laughed, the other shook his head. 9 years? The older man called. You really think you'll wait 9 years for these trees? Daniel didn't answer. He tightened the soil around the fragile stem and stood. To everyone watching, the land was worthless. To Daniel, it was the beginning of something they couldn't see. That afternoon, word spread through the village. By sunset, people were already calling him crazy. But nobody knew what Daniel had discovered beneath that neglected hillside. And nobody could have imagined that 9 years later, the same people who laughed would stand beneath his trees without saying a word. Daniel had never been the kind of man people expected to succeed. He lived simply, worked whenever work appeared, and saved whatever little money remained after the bills were paid. His clothes were old. His truck had more rust than paint. Even his house seemed to lean into the wind when storms came through. But the thing that embarrassed him most was not poverty. It was the land. 30 acres of neglected hillside had belonged to his family for years. Most people considered it useless. The ground was uneven, the weeds grew thick, and nothing valuable seemed willing to grow there. A wealthy developer had once offered Daniel money for it. Sell it, people told him. At least you'll have something to show for it. Daniel refused. Instead, he began talking about chestnut trees. The reaction was immediate. People laughed because chestnuts required patience. They laughed because Daniel had almost no money to spare. They laughed because wealthy farmers nearby were planting crops that produced returns within months while Daniel was preparing to spend years waiting for trees. You need money now, someone told him. Daniel looked across the empty hillside. I know. What you're doing won't make you rich. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the soil. I didn't say it would. That answer confused them. What they didn't understand was that Daniel wasn't trying to become rich quickly. He was trying to build something that would still be standing long after the people laughing at him had forgotten his name. The first year was harder than Daniel had imagined. Before sunrise, he carried tools up the hillside while cold air burned his lungs. He cleared weeds by hand, dug holes through stubborn earth, and planted one sapling after another. There were no machines. There were no employees. There was only Daniel. By the time the sun disappeared behind the hills, his palms were split and bleeding. Dirt covered his boots. His back hurt so badly that some nights he could barely climb the steps to his bedroom. Still, the next morning he returned. At first, people watched with curiosity. Then they began watching for failure. When several young trees died during an unexpected dry spell, someone left dead branches beside Daniel's fence. Another neighbor laughed whenever he passed. You still planting those? Daniel kept working. The hardest part wasn't the physical labor. It was hearing people reduce his dream to a joke. At the local store, conversations stopped when he entered. At the market, someone whispered, "There goes the tree man." Daniel pretended not to hear. But at night, alone beneath the dim light of his kitchen, doubt found him. He would spread his bills across the table and calculate what remained. Then he would look through the window toward the black hillside. For a few seconds, fear would win. What if they were right? What if 9 years passed and nothing changed? Daniel never found an easy answer. He simply woke before dawn and planted another tree. By the second year, Daniel had learned that planting trees was the easy part. Keeping them alive was something else entirely. Summer arrived with almost no rain. The soil cracked beneath the heat, and the young chestnut leaves curled at their edges. Daniel carried water uphill in heavy containers until his shoulders burned. Then came insects. Small holes appeared in leaves that had looked perfect only days before. Daniel spent nights researching what was happening. He read old agricultural books, watched lectures, studied weather records, and spoke with anyone who knew anything about chestnuts. The more he learned, the more difficult the project became. He discovered that the trees needed protection, proper spacing, careful pruning, and years of patience. Years. That word began to haunt him. Meanwhile, his neighbors' fields were producing crops. Their barns filled. Their businesses expanded. Daniel's hillside still looked almost empty. One evening, he stood among hundreds of young trees and counted the dead ones. Too many. He sank onto a rock and stared at the ground. For the first time, he wondered whether stubbornness and courage were actually the same thing. Then he noticed something. The trees closest to one particular section of the hillside were growing faster. Their leaves were darker. Their trunks were stronger. Daniel walked toward them and crouched beside the soil. He touched it between his fingers. Something about this land was different. He just didn't know why yet. Daniel began testing the hillside in a way nobody around him understood. He dug small samples from different areas and compared them. He studied moisture levels, drainage, sunlight, and the movement of water after rainfall. What he found slowly changed his understanding of the land. The hillside wasn't worthless. It was unusual. Beneath the surface lay a combination of soil and drainage conditions that could support chestnut trees remarkably well. A natural slope carried excess water away, while another section retained enough moisture during dry periods. But there was a catch. The conditions were useful only if the trees were given enough time to establish themselves. That was the part nobody wanted to hear. Years of waiting. Daniel discovered something else, too. An older chestnut variety could potentially thrive there better than the common varieties being planted nearby. The trees would take longer to mature, but once established, they could become exceptionally productive. Suddenly, his 9-year idea didn't seem completely foolish. It seemed risky, very risky, but risk was different from madness. Daniel stood on the hillside as evening light turned the soil gold. He imagined the trees grown tall. He imagined branches heavy with chestnuts. He imagined the empty spaces between them disappearing beneath shade. Then another thought came. If he was right, why had nobody else noticed? And if he was wrong, how many years would he lose before discovering it? Daniel had no way to know, so he planted more. By the 4th year, Daniel's life had become almost unrecognizable. The hillside was greener, but his bank account was thinner. His neighbors had stopped laughing as loudly, yet none of them respected what he was doing. They simply thought he was stubborn. For years was long enough to prove that Daniel hadn't quit. It was also long enough to prove that he hadn't succeeded. That uncertainty followed him everywhere. While other people spent their evenings relaxing, Daniel walked the plantation with a flashlight, checking young trunks for damage. While others celebrated good harvests, he calculated irrigation costs. While other families talked about vacations and new purchases, Daniel talked about roots. Sometimes he wondered whether he had sacrificed too much. He had missed opportunities. He had turned down the developer's offer. He had spent years building something that still couldn't pay him back. Yet each spring brought a little more evidence that the forest was changing. The trunks thickened. The canopy began closing. Birds returned. The hillside that once looked dead had started to breathe. Daniel noticed these changes before anyone else did. And perhaps that was why he continued. Success wasn't arriving as one dramatic moment. It was arriving quietly, one leaf at a time. Still, the hardest years were not behind him. They were coming. The storm came during the 7th year. It arrived at night with violent wind and rain that hammered the roof for hours. Daniel woke before dawn. Something felt wrong. When he reached the hillside, he stopped at the fence. Several young trees had been torn apart. Branches covered the ground. Roots were exposed. Mud had washed across the lower section of the plantation. Daniel walked slowly through the damage. For 7 years, he had protected those trees from drought, insects, animals, and neglect. One night had undone months of progress. He stood there until the rain soaked through his jacket. Then someone approached. It was the developer who had once offered to buy the property. "I'll make the offer again," the man said. Daniel looked at him. "You don't have to keep doing this." The words were gentle, but Daniel understood what they meant. The forest was damaged. His money was nearly gone. The opportunity to walk away was standing directly in front of him. For the first time, Daniel seriously considered it. He walked among the broken trees, touching splintered trunks with his fingertips. Then he noticed something strange. The trees that had survived the storm were the strongest ones on the entire hillside, and several were already carrying tiny clusters where flowers had appeared. Daniel stared at them. His exhaustion disappeared. Maybe the forest wasn't dying. Maybe it was finally becoming what he had waited for. The first meaningful harvest came quietly. There was no celebration, no crowd, no newspaper. Daniel simply walked beneath the trees one cool morning and saw them scattered across the ground. Chestnuts. He picked one up. Its shell was smooth and dark, shining beneath the leaves. For a moment, Daniel just held it. 9 years of work had reduced itself to something that fit inside his palm. He opened another. The nut inside was full, clean, and surprisingly large. Then he looked around. There were hundreds. The trees were producing. Not a few. Not enough to prove a point. Enough to change the future. Daniel gathered the first baskets himself. When buyers saw the quality, their reaction was immediate. Questions began arriving. How many trees did he have? What variety were they? How much could he produce? Could he supply them next season? Daniel answered carefully. He had learned patience. But outside the farm, something else was happening. People were talking. The same hillside they had called worthless was suddenly attracting attention. And for the first time in 9 years, people weren't asking Daniel when he would give up. They were asking how he had managed to keep going. The transformation was almost impossible to recognize. The barren hillside had vanished beneath a living canopy. Chestnut trees stretched toward the sky in long, orderly rows, their branches overlapping until the plantation looked less like farmland and more like a forest that had always belonged there. Wind moved through the leaves with a soft rushing sound. Birds nested among the branches. The ground smelled of damp earth, bark, and fallen leaves. And beneath the trees, chestnuts covered the soil. Daniel walked slowly through the rows. 9 years earlier, he had stood here alone with a shovel while people laughed from the road. Now workers moved between the trees. Trucks arrived at the property. Buyers walked the land. People who had once ignored Daniel suddenly wanted to know his methods. But Daniel didn't feel victorious in the way they expected. He remembered the dead saplings, the sleepless nights, the bills spread across his kitchen table, the storm, the offer to buy the land. Every tree seemed to contain a memory, and yet something still remained unanswered. How valuable was the forest really? Daniel knew the harvest was good. He knew the buyers were interested, but he hadn't yet calculated what 9 years of patience had actually created. That number was about to silence everyone. The final figures arrived after the harvest was weighed. Daniel stared at the paperwork for several seconds. Then he read it again. The number was far larger than he had expected. The plantation wasn't merely surviving. It had become a serious agricultural operation. The land that once struggled to attract a buyer was now generating an annual harvest worth several times what Daniel had originally invested. More importantly, the trees were still young. Their productivity could increase as they matured. Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table that evening. For 9 years, he had been measuring success in tiny victories. One living tree, one repaired fence, one survived summer, one new branch. Now the numbers were finally speaking a language everyone understood. Money. Suddenly, the people who had called him crazy had nothing left to say. But Daniel surprised them again. When someone asked how much the land was worth, he didn't smile. He simply looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the tops of the chestnut trees moved gently in the evening wind. "This isn't about the land," he said, "because there was something more valuable than the harvest." Daniel had spent 9 years building proof that a person could be dismissed, ridiculed, and underestimated and still be right. They came slowly at first. A neighbor stopped beside the fence and asked about chestnut prices. Then another wanted to know where Daniel bought his seedlings. Soon, people who had once laughed at him were walking through the forest asking for advice. The change was almost comical, but Daniel didn't laugh. He remembered every face, every joke, Every time someone had told him to sell the land. Every time someone had suggested he was wasting his life. Now they stood beneath his trees and spoke differently. One man who had mocked him for years finally admitted, "I thought you were wasting everything." Daniel nodded. "So did I sometimes." That answer surprised him. He didn't pretend the 9 years had been easy. He didn't rewrite his past as though confidence had carried him effortlessly forward. There had been fear. There had been regret. There had been nights when he almost quit. The difference was that he had continued despite those feelings. That was what the others had never understood. Daniel hadn't possessed some magical certainty that guaranteed success. He had simply refused to let other people's certainty about his failure become his own. And now, when they looked at him, they no longer saw a poor man planting trees. They saw the owner of a forest they couldn't ignore. Everyone assumed Daniel would sell. The offers became larger as word spread. Developers saw valuable land. Agricultural companies saw future production. Investors saw an opportunity. Daniel listened. Then he said no. The forest had become more than an investment. It was the result of 9 years that could never be replaced. He decided to keep the land and expand the plantation. But he also wanted others to learn from what had happened. He began helping local growers understand the conditions he had discovered. He shared mistakes that had cost him money and explained lessons that had taken years to understand. Some people thought that was strange. After everything they had said about him, why help them? Daniel's answer was simple. Because he knew what it felt like to begin alone. He remembered carrying his first sapling uphill. He remembered looking at empty ground and seeing something that didn't exist yet. Now he wanted someone else to experience that moment. The forest had given him financial security, but it had also given him something money couldn't buy. A chance to turn his years of failure into someone else's beginning. Eventually, the story became simple. Daniel had been called crazy because he had believed in something before there was evidence. But the truth was more complicated. He had been afraid. He had doubted himself. He had nearly quit. He simply kept moving through those moments. The forest became a monument to delayed results. Every trunk represented another season of patience. Every branch carried another year of criticism. Every chestnut was proof that invisible work could eventually become impossible to ignore. People often admire success after it becomes visible. They rarely admire the years when success is still buried underground. Daniel understood that now. He didn't need the people who had mocked him to apologize. He didn't need them to admit they were wrong. The forest had already answered for him. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. He had spent 9 years trying to grow trees. In the process, he had grown into someone who no longer needed permission to believe in his own future. One autumn morning, Daniel walked beneath the chestnut trees before sunrise. The air was cold. Leaves moved softly overhead. Chestnuts covered the ground like small brown stones scattered across a golden carpet. He stopped beside the first tree. It was no longer small. Its trunk was thick, its branches wide, its crown reaching high above him. Daniel placed one hand against the bark. For a moment, he remembered the day he had planted it. The laughter, the questions, the word crazy. 9 years had passed. The people who had laughed were silent now. But Daniel wasn't interested in proving them wrong anymore. He looked across the forest and smiled. Because the greatest thing he had built wasn't the money. It wasn't even the trees. It was the lesson hidden inside them. Some things take years before they become visible. Some dreams look foolish while they are still buried beneath the soil. And sometimes, the difference between failure and success is simply having the courage to keep caring after everyone else has stopped believing. Daniel picked up a chestnut from the ground. Then he walked farther into the forest, where another young sapling waited to be planted. The story was 9 years old. The forest was only beginning.